From Huck Finn to drag queens, children's literature has always been a deeply divisive subject. But is this because of parental overprotectiveness or political bias? In this episode, we look at the books and the people who have made headlines for all the wrong reasons, as we ask, why is children's literature so political? Welcome to America, a history podcast. I'm Liam Heffernan, and every week we answer a different question to understand the people, the places, and the events that make the USA what it is today. Returning from the faculty this week is Thomas Smith, Professor of American Literature and Culture and Deputy Director of Area Studies at the University of East Anglia. Welcome back, Tom.
Hello, great to be here again.
Yep, always a pleasure. And our special guest this week is Jonathan Hamilt, the Executive Director of Drag Story Hour since 2019, after co-founding the New York City chapter in 2016. Being a strong communicator, he's connected the chapter's organisers and storytellers with each other on a global scale. And since being named Executive Director, Drag Story Hour has presented at Harvard, Yale, South by Southwest, ABA, and the Medical Library Association. That is a lot of places. Welcome to the show, Jonathan.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a real pleasure to have you on, and I think we're going to have a really good discussion. So firstly, Jonathan, before we get started, for those who haven't heard of Drag Story Hour, tell us a bit more about it.
Yeah, Drag Story Hour is exactly like it sounds. It's drag artists that read to kids in public schools and libraries and bookstores and community areas all over the US and the world. We have about 30 US chapters active right now, and we have about a dozen official chapters globally.
Nice. And obviously a lot of people probably have heard of Drag Story Hour, maybe not for the best reasons, which we're going to dive into. But first, let's kind of go back to the start and establish some context here. Tom, I wonder if you can give us a bit of a whistle-stop tour of scandals, for want of a better word, in children's literature.
Sure. I mean, I guess you could say it's all scandal on some level, because the issues of what children should be reading, whether they should be reading, how they should be reading it, really go right back through the centuries, and almost predate the idea of a particular literature for children as a distinct thing. I mean, in an American context, if you go back to the Puritan era, 17th century, 18th century, obviously there's a really significant bias against popular literature of pretty much all forms, right? So unless it's something spiritually edifying, then essentially it's on the kind of banned books list within a Puritan context. Generally, when we're thinking about the development of children's literature as something distinct unto itself, we date that to around the middle of the 18th century, when a London publisher called John Newbery starts producing small books of largely fairy tales, alphabets, reading primers, which are directed towards children, and things do grow from there. But in the American context, again, it's not really until the early 19th century that American writers start trying to think about what a distinctively American children's literature might look like. And that's something that, along with our students and my colleague, Dr. Hilary Emmett, we've been thinking about quite a lot at the moment, because one of the key figures in that process was a writer called Lydia Maria Child. And if we just think about her career as a children's writer, I think it's really instructive to think about the way so many of the themes that we're probably thinking about today go right back into the roots of children's literature. So Lydia Maria Child was a really prolific writer who pioneered in loads of genres. So she writes parenting manuals, domestic manuals. She's an early American novelist. And one of the things that she's first in, if you like, is trying to create a really distinctive American literature for children. And she starts writing children's books in the 1820s. And she's quite strict, according to how we might think about things, in terms of what she thinks is appropriate for children. I mean, she's much more liberal than lots of the children's literature that's been published up until that point. But when she's advising parents about what kind of reading matter their children should have, she's quite strict that novels should be pretty rationed, right? She calls them a kind of literary confectionery. She warns that too much fiction kind of dulls your palate as a reader and makes you unable to read other forms of books. So, be careful about what you give your children to read. And she actually specifically says that children should never read anything without a mother's knowledge and sanction. Right. So again, the idea that parental oversight was really crucial for children to be given only the most appropriate children's reading matter. Now, this was a bit ironic on some level, because when she was a child herself, she had snuck into her brother's bedroom and read the novels that he had been getting out of local libraries against her own parents' wishes, which certainly probably helped her on the way to becoming a really important American writer. And when she starts writing children's literature, one of the really interesting things, I think, is that she takes on political subjects, right? So she talks about slavery in America. She talks about Native American rights. So she brings up these big issues with children and attempts to engage children with some of the most pressing issues in American life. And these are really popular. She's kind of lauded throughout America, sells lots of copies of her books, and she sets up a magazine for children, probably the most important magazine for children in the early 19th century. And that's very successful for about 8 years. And then she does something which, to use contemporary terminology, gets her cancelled. Right? The magazine is cancelled because the subscribers flock away from the magazine. She can't really publish books for children anymore for a while. And what she does to cause this to happen is to write an abolitionist book. She writes a book condemning slavery. And bear in mind, this is in Boston, right? And she's the darling of the publishing industry in many ways in Boston. But even in Boston in the 1830s, to come out with such a public statement against slavery puts you in a category of too controversial to be trusted with our children. And so that's the end of her pioneering magazine, the Juvenile Miscellany. And I think that's such a great potted history of how we can go right back to the roots of what we might call an American children's literature. And we can see that from the start, it's hedged around with these really strong concerns about what should children read and not read, that already it's engaging with issues which are felt to be politically contentious, and that, who gets to tell stories to children and whether or not they're within the social pale is also heavily policed. So it would seem unthinkable to us these days that someone making a public statement against slavery would mean that you were no longer trusted to edit a children's magazine. But that's exactly what happened to Lydia Maria Child. So, and we have a collection of her children's stories coming out next year that we've worked on in association with our students. So hopefully we will be able to bring them back to a new generation.
And that's a lovely little plug there, Tom. Thank you for that. But I think we can look back on examples like that and think, oh, that was a terrible time. How can people ban someone for writing about slavery or abolitionism? But we have a very parallel problem today, in that it's not maybe texts about race or slavery, but it's books about LGBTQ. It's books that people take issue with for transphobic reasons, for homophobic reasons. And Jonathan, I know that's something you've maybe personally dealt with, in terms of you're the people reading those books, and that's another layer that we'll come on to. But what are your sort of thoughts really on how this sort of homophobia and transphobia is driving the agenda in schools?
Yeah, as Tom said, every era has its defining political and social issues, and literature is often a reflection of those issues. And what we might think is overly political in one area or one era may not be in the next. And, as our society becomes more diverse and more inclusive, and there's a push and a need for children's literature that represents a wider range of representation and experiences and backgrounds, that emphasis alone on representation is political in itself. And it's challenging the status quo and traditional norms in kind of white Christian America. So we're seeing even our language, how we identify, the language we use to identify ourselves, is growing and changing at a rapid pace. And otherness or difference is seen as scary and demonized. And that's kind of what's happening now, at least in the US.
And with Drag Story Hour, the issues aren't just about the books being read to children; it's about who's reading them. And I'm sure you can speak a lot on the controversies that you've faced in scaling up Drag Story Hour. But I guess first of all, if you could give a bit of context for people who don't know what has been happening in the last year, and why do you think it's so contentious?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting. Our organization has been around since 2015. And to put out there, we don't own the intellectual property to dress in costume and read to kids. People have been doing it since the dawn of time, and I'm sure a version of queer story hour or drag story hour has been happening for a long time. But we've been around for almost 10 years, and the initial response was very positive. We had great write-ups in the New York Times, the New Yorker, Cosmopolitan Magazine, NBC, ABC. Everyone was really excited and interested in this new literacy program. But then we saw a turn of events with Roe versus Wade being overturned in the US, and our January 6th attacks on the Capitol really changed how people view us, and organized hate groups would come out to our events and protest our events at libraries and bookstores and schools. And I think what's happening is people not being educated or knowledgeable in queer lives or drag itself, not knowing that drag is a queer art form. And like any form of art, like any form of literature, can be catered to different groups of people. So of course, if you think of a drag queen, you might think of like adult nightlife, or you might think of like the burlesque community, which exists and is real and is great, but obviously not appropriate for children. And our program and organization does children's appropriate events using child appropriate art to instill and have kids experience otherness, cultural literacy, and reading literacy. And I think that's a big disconnect. And if you are homophobic or transphobic, you're lumping everyone into one group. You're putting drag queens and drag kings and burlesque and nightlife and adult entertainment into one big pot and demonizing a whole group of people just because of the media and literature that you've been fed your whole life. And that's what's happening. And I think for too long, just children and children's literature and protecting the children and saving the children has just been a scapegoat for political parties and to demonize queer people in general.
I think there's a really interesting historical parallel for some of this as well, especially that sense of putting children on the front line of the culture war, if you like, in this sense, and the intersectionality of these things. If we think back to late 1870s, 1880s, and the amazing moral panic that surrounded dime novels. So dime novels were kind of cheap storybooks marketed at young readers primarily, especially a kind of newly literate young readership, as well as literacy rates were improving and print was becoming cheaper. And looking back, it like any modern moral panic you can see play out in the way in which dime novels became a really controversial part of popular culture, because it was thought that they were violent, it was thought that they corrupted children on a moral level. And off the back of this panic, a man called Anthony Comstock came to be peculiarly powerful in American life for a significant period of time. He formed an organization called the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, and he really put dime novels at the front of his kind of moral campaign. He wrote a book about them called Traps for the Young. So that's how he framed them. And he said, these stories breed vulgarity, profanity, loose ideas of life, impurity of thought and deed. They render the imagination unclean, destroy domestic peace, desolate homes, cheapen women's virtue, and make foul-mouthed bullies, cheats, vagabonds, thieves, desperados, and libertines. So this was all the fault of the dime novel. But he actually got into a position of quite significant power by running this campaign against dime novels and setting up this organization. And he got Congress to pass what were known as the Comstock laws. And this made it illegal to send material by the US mail that was deemed to be obscene, lewd, or lascivious. And this was an enormously overarching umbrella, therefore, and an enormous amount of power that landed in Comstock's lap. And at certain points, he was even banning anatomy textbooks from being sent through the post. He was certainly trying to police any information that would relate to abortion, sexuality, in ways that were kind of fundamental to people's education. So I think that's a really interesting example of the way in which children's literature can be used as a wedge in order to kind of enact policy and bring in actions which have much, much further reaching implications.
Yeah, it's a great political tactic. Like who is going to challenge someone saying that they want to protect the morality and safety of children? It sounds great, right? But the ripple effect of what's happening now, it's all too similar. We just have iPhones now, but these politicians are saying the exact same things. And with the banned books and the drag bans happening, it's a ripple effect, because banning drag, what does that mean? Drag is art. Are you banning art and humanities? There's a very powerful historical figure that tried to wipe out arts and humanities of a whole group of people in a country. And it's a means to no end, right? It's like, okay, so these anti-drag bills and laws are extremely harmful and scary towards the trans community. In the state of Tennessee in the US, it's one of the states where you can't change your gender marker on your driver's license. So if a trans woman gets pulled over by a police officer, what's to say that police officer says that this person is a drag queen and not a trans woman? Now you are considered a sex offender and a felon in the country. So it's very nebulous, and there's such ripple effects of what these bills and laws can do. And they're not just going to stop at children's literature. We're seeing this in the country where they're, taking African American studies out of classrooms, even in universities. And it's not just about literacy as in the ability to read, but also this cultural literacy of what are we allowed to read and what we are allowed to be educated on.
Yeah, and it kind of brings me on to wondering why politicians care enough to get involved in this. Because, for every hardcore Republican there is who wants, every image of a drag queen to be burnt at the stake, there's, I believe, many more people that don't or are at least ambivalent. So why is this an issue?
As Whitney Houston said, children are the future. So, if you can control the education and indoctrination of a future generation, it's a great way to control the masses. If you are gatekeeping what is being published, what is being taught, then you can control everybody. And I think this is a cornerstone of definitely far-right American politics, is to gain control over our minds and over our physical bodies and what we can and cannot do and educate ourselves on.
And has that ever worked in America? I mean, Tom, historically, all the controversies that have happened because of books, all the bans and the outcry about certain publications, has it ever made a difference?
Well, that's a good question. I guess it depends how we define made a difference. I mean, I suppose it's one of those things that often does come in waves. That you have particular flare-ups at different points, and you have times which are more concerned with banning books, with restricting access to certain kinds of books, certain kinds of moral panics which appear and then for future generations seem essentially unintelligible on some level. So maybe there is a kind of wave effect to some of this, that we are at a significant peak, I think it's fair to say, of a certain kind of censorious culture in American life, and whether or not that then will subside over the coming years and be replaced by a different kind of moral panic is, I guess, one possibility. On the other hand, perhaps things intensify, and certainly I think this year has been a record year for the number of book banning requests, if you like, that the American Library Association has tracked. So it's clear that this is definitely its own cultural moment now, that is a particular kind of zenith, if you like, of debate around children's access to certain kinds of reading matter and the implications of that.
And nowadays information is spread so fast, like with the internet and with audiobooks. And with the New York Public Library, we have a tab on their site where you can just watch Drag Story Hour events virtually from the comfort of your own home. And a lot of the books we read are banned books. So I guess unlike the past, it's really easy to get your hands on anything that's either challenged or banned. And, subculture always flourishes in a time of some group trying to silence another group. And more art is being made and more story hours are popping up. And we are expanding our chapters and reading more books and reading more banned books. So it's kind of, in a way, fuel for the flame.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, actually, and I think that has always been the case as well. I mean, certainly the dime novel panic in the 1880s did not put an end to dime novels, and you can probably imagine actually stoked the interest of plenty of young readers who might not have picked them up. And certainly, if we think about a book which has been, I think, probably banned for one reason or another since it was published in 1884, 1885, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, famously, Concord Library refused to put Huckleberry Finn on its shelves when it was first released. And Mark Twain was delighted because he knew what that would mean for sales. He knew what that would mean for publicity. So I think that's probably as true now as it was then, in many ways.
That's so interesting. I grew up in the southern states in the U.S. and I went to a small private Christian school, a Southern Baptist school church growing up till 6th grade. And, we had a school library, just one small room, but even on the shelves, we did have Huck Finn. And even in that book alone, the school took like a Sharpie and took out different paragraphs and took out different sayings. We had Robin Hood. We had all these different classical books that are like kind of like open source books that had Sharpies and like different passages like striked through so you couldn't read it. So even as a 4th, 5th grader, I was like, this is so odd. Like, this is so weird. Like, I'm going to find this at the library anyway. Like, why are you trying to censor this out? It's just fascinating how some things kind of do stand the test of time. And, a lot of it's a twofold, right? It's like these banned books with the material that why it's being banned. And then you have kind of banned people reading the banned books. And it's just so interesting that we bring a double whammy to the situation with people that are against it. And, much like the banned books and the banned topics is a banned group of people, right? So like queer people, and around the world and in America, we've been pushed to the shadows and into the darkness for so long. And that darkness and shadows has been nightlife. And, we love nightlife. That's where we find our community and we find each other and we cultivate and grow creativity. But not all of us enjoy nightlife. I don't want to be out till 3 a.m. I want to take my queerness and activism into the daylight, into society, into my community and give back. But it's been so foreign and pushed into the shadows for so long. People equate our whole entire existence with adult themes, adult acts, nightlife. And it's like, no, queer people exist outside. We have families, we have children, we have jobs. A lot of our storytellers and readers are educators, do work at universities, are social workers, do have kids, are parents, are caregivers, are librarians. And it's just important to have all the context before yelling and screaming of, what we're doing.
I'm very aware that what I'm about to ask is antagonistic, but I will ask it anyway, because one of the opportunities that you have as Drag Story Hour is to raise awareness and start conversations about drag and about lifestyles and communities that the people who might be offended by that wouldn't necessarily be well informed about. By them picking banned books, do you think that just, as you said before, it kind of adds fuel to the fire and alienates the people that might actually have a chance otherwise to learn a bit more about who you are and what you do?
No, I don't think so, because I think if you can't get over the queer representation of just seeing a person in drag in front of you, it's not going to matter if they're even reading the Bible. So I don't think the books actually matter in the sense that it's going to deter people from coming to our program. And, it's like these banned books that are up for debate are just very simple books. We have Todd Parr, who's a children's author, who wrote a book, It's Okay to Be Different. And each page is, it's okay to have a big nose, it's okay to be bald, it's okay to, be XYZ. And on one page, it's okay that somebody has 2 dads and somebody has 2 moms. One page and a full book of different, physical differences. And just acknowledging that there is difference in the world is the banned part of it. So it's like we're reading books that are just challenge for just showing people windows and mirrors to themselves and to the world. And those are the banned books we're reading at our story hours. It's okay to have two moms or two dads, and that's just one page.
And I guess that's sort of the crux of it, really, is that it's not really about the books. It's particularly with Drag Story Hour, it's about the context and the people reading it. And even back, historically, you mentioned all those examples. The books really are a manifestation of bigger issues and divides within society and culture. So maybe it's a good thing. Maybe these controversial books getting banned is a good thing because it creates and ignites that conversation, and that's what we need. So maybe job done, right?
I mean, yeah, and the power of the internet is you get nifty little lists and links, and you can buy it instantaneously and read it from your screen or order it. So information is spread very quickly.
Well, I mean, just to pick up on that idea that context is everything, and I think that's really true if we think about it in a transatlantic context. Because, I mean, if we think about the context of something like Drag Story Hour in the UK, well, you could argue we've been doing that for over 200 years, but we just called it pantomime because obviously pantomime dames have been at the centre of a certain type of British culture entertainment, specifically family entertainment, probably many children's first and maybe only encounter with theatrical storytelling since I think 1806, I think was the first pantomime dame. So, it's interesting that you shift the context slightly and you change the conversation, then something becomes a hot button issue when it has been a core component of British culture, at least for centuries, let's say.
I mean, it's never been about drag. It's never been about drag queens. It's never been about dressing up in character to reach children. We've been surrounded by drag our whole lives in theater and film. There's this video of Rudy Giuliani in drag with Donald Trump. There's been tons of the U.S. Army has dressed up in drag and put on benefits and raised money and awareness for different things. It's nothing new. It's about control and about power and about eliminating queer people out of existence. And a lot of people just don't know the difference. They're not educated or they don't read enough books about the difference between gender and sexuality and drag versus the trans or non-binary community, or they go straight to this kind of sexual fetish zone of when they think of drag. And if they're going down that road, then the only person who's sexualizing this is yourself, and you might need to ask yourself questions of why you think this is sexual to you. So it's really about just education and knowledge. And if you really want to educate yourself, it's gonna scare you because it's gonna blow your whole existence away and knowing and your bigotry and your trans and homophobia if you do get educated. So
yeah, and that's a very strong point to end on. But before I let both of you go, I did just want to ask, I guess, a bit of a tongue-in-cheek question. If you had the choice and the power to ban any book of your choosing, what would it be and why? Try not to be too controversial here. I don't want a lawsuit.
That's so funny. You know what? I would, if I could ban one book, tongue in cheek, not seriously, but it would be Marie Kondo's Does It Bring Joy, the cleaning book. Because after I read that, my Virgo self went insane and went through my whole entire apartment, getting rid of stuff and be like, does it spark joy? And holding up my wigs, does this bring me joy? So that really changed my life, that book. So yeah.
As a fellow Virgo, I can appreciate the impetus there, definitely. I only have a fence-sitting answer, which is to give an ambiguous answer, which is to say, builds on a quote from Emily Drabinsky, who's the president of the American Library Association, who recently said, "Children are people who deserve private reading lives," which I thought is a really, really interesting statement and really resonated with me because I think probably I am the grown-up version of a child who definitely was allowed to have a private reading life, who spent a lot of time pretty much with unfettered access to local libraries, and that seems to me a really good principle to stand by. But I would also say that as a parent to children myself now, that becomes a more interesting question about what that means. And when I think back about some of the things I was reading with essentially unfettered access to a local library at the age they are now, and I think, would I want them reading that? Then that really that becomes something to conjure with. So it's probably good to question yourself about those kind of things. And I don't have a good answer about what book I would ban, and I'm not generally in favour of banning books, but I think it's interesting how an easy answer to that question gets more complicated at different points potentially.
I mean, that's one of the main reasons why I do drag story hours is the representation, and children need more representation in the books they read and the media they consume. And there's a big lack of POC and LGBT characters in children's books. And those are the books that are being banned and challenged the most. And when I was 15, the only things I could get my hands on were Rent and Angels in America, which were the only kind of widely around queer literature, and that's widely inappropriate for a 15-year-old. It talks about the AIDS epidemic and homelessness in New York City. But imagine if I had access or drag story time or books that told me it's okay to be different, it's okay to feel different, you're special and unique just the way you are. It would be life-changing. So I think having humans access to anything that they can read is super important and should never be banned. So
This episode of America, a history podcast, was produced, edited and hosted by me, Liam Heffernan. A special thanks to our guests this week, Thomas Smith from UEA and, of course, Jonathan Hamilt from Drag Story Hour. And if you're interested in any of the stuff we've talked about, there are some extra resources in the show notes for you to check out as well. And a lot of work goes into making this podcast, so if you could leave us a rating or review wherever you're listening, that would be really great. Next time, to celebrate Black History Month, we're looking at the life of one of America's most inspiring individuals as we ask, who is Frederick Douglass?